Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. Here's local historian Dr. Bruce Venter.
Hello, everyone. This is Bruce Venter, and welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments, brought to you by Lake George Battlefield Alliance and Lake George Radio. I am a trustee on the Alliance board, and our guest today is Dr. Matt Keagle, who is curator at Fort Ticonderoga. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Bruce. It's good to be with you.
As part of Fort Ticonderoga's real-time revolution, the folks at the fort are recreating Henry Knox's part in bringing the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga all the way over to Boston for George Washington. And they've got quite a reenactment planned for the first weekend in December. Matt, could you elaborate on that for us?
Certainly. Henry Knox's expedition to Ticonderoga in the winter of 1775 still stands as one of the most remarkable achievements of the Revolution in many ways. And it's remarkable not just for the accomplishment, but I think once we dive into the details, which we certainly try to do here at Fort Ticonderoga, it becomes even more interesting and engages an even broader set of people than just Henry Knox, who deservedly gets the credit for this operation. But it represents a lot about the first year of the American Revolution because, of course, as you remember, it's because of the cannon that are here at Ticonderoga that had been left over after the French and Indian War that Ticonderoga and Crown Point became targets of American revolutionaries. And I think some people still have received knowledge that Henry Knox comes up with the idea to go to Ticonderoga to get cannon. In fact, this was the impetus for the expeditions that captured the fort in May, both from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they accomplish that mission, they get the cannon, but then there's a bit of a sticking point initially because Congress, who had not authorized the expedition, finds itself in a bit of a bind in that these colonies have gone ahead and expanded the war dramatically beyond the area just outside Boston, and they've done it without congressional approval or knowledge, and so they're left with this situation. And the first instinct of Congress is actually to take that cannon and not immediately move it all to Boston, but to inventory it carefully. And those guns were ordered by Congress the week after the capture of the fort, when they get news of it, to get inventoried, to get shipped down to Fort George, to stay at the southern end of Lake George, where they feel they'll be safe, they'll be carefully stored, and they'll be carefully documented so that when this is all over, they can be handed back to the crown, which is pretty remarkable. And this draws the ire of colonies like Connecticut and Massachusetts, who feel that this is basically abandoning all that they've accomplished in capturing Ticonderoga, Crown Point, opening the door to Canada, and then the resources as well that were taken there, like that artillery. And as a consequence, what happens is they don't fully move all the guns. Benedict Arnold, who is the field commander for Massachusetts in the region, actually begins the process of moving some of that artillery from Crown Point to Ticonderoga, and then from Ticonderoga across Lake George to Fort George. So there are some guns that are getting south in May and June of 1775. However, Arnold, of course, resigns his commission and he's gone by the latter part of June in 1775. And by that point, you've got the creation of the Continental Army. You've got Philip Schuyler being appointed to command the Northern Department. And the Army here is starting to look ever more to the north, to a possible Canadian invasion, which gets launched in August. In doing so, it leaves the guns at Ticonderoga and Crown Point kind of idle, sitting there, waiting while the Army is advancing northward. And this is still the case by the fall, when Washington is meeting with various congressional officials and other representatives, and they're thinking about, well, where do we get the artillery that we need to break the siege of Boston? The agreement of all that are in attendance is that it's at New York City and it's up here on Lake Champlain. This becomes the impetus for Washington to issue orders to Henry Knox, who, interestingly enough, is not a soldier at the time. He is a private citizen. He's a bookseller from Boston who's fled the British occupation of his home city, but he's made himself useful to the Continental Army by employing his knowledge of military engineering and theory gained from wide reading. And he's been recommended by a number of people, including Washington, but also John Adams, who see the talent in this young officer. This becomes a chance for him to prove himself, and Washington gives him the assignment. And he departs here. And it might be said with very little ultimately other than his instructions. He's only given $1,000. He's got his brother along with him to accomplish, a pretty daunting feat of logistics. But this is where it's important to understand the broader context and how at the same time that Washington writes a letter to Knox giving him instructions for his expedition, he also sends a letter to Philip Schuyler in command up here in the Northern Department. And that is to aid and assist Knox in this operation. And this is vital because Schuyler has the local knowledge of not just the landscape, the military posts, the manpower that's there, but also the civilian infrastructure and what can be used to facilitate an operation like this. In that sense, too, the expedition is an interesting example of, what today we might call a public-private collaboration, in that it involves both Continental soldiers and civilians along various parts of this expedition. And of course, he's ultimately successful. Knox manages to transport 60 tons of artillery that had been stored and stockpiled here, and gets them to the American siege lines outside Boston, where they provide the Continental Army with a valuable, not just resource, but kind of sense of strength that they bring with them. And it's not just artillery. There's a volume of lead that's vital for casting musket balls, as well as flint that's needed for muskets in the Continental Army. So it's a variety of different military provisions, which gives Washington's force an added confidence going into the spring, and ultimately they're able to force the British out of Boston in March of 1776. And by that point, Knox has already gotten his commission as colonel of the Continental Artillery Regiment, which he will lead through the war and eventually, rise quite high, not only in the circle of the Continental Army, but in the government of the young United States.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt, for being with us. Truly interesting information. Anyone who wants to know more about what they heard here can go to our YouTube channel and go to Lake George Battlefield Moments. There's a lot of good historical information on there from top name historians that we've been interviewing over the course of the last year or so. Lake George Battlefield Moments.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more information or to check out the latest podcast, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and listen live on Saturday mornings at 9:40 a.m. to Lake George Battlefield Moments on 93.5 Lake FM.